Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. My dad will be so grateful. See you next time on the Mindful Fire podcast.
Welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast, a show about crafting a life you love and making work optional, using the tools of mindfulness, envisioning, and financial independence. I'm your host, Adam Coelho, and I'm so glad you're here. Each episode of the Mindful Fire podcast explores these 3 tools through teachings, guided meditations, and inspiring interviews with people actually living them to craft a life they love. At its core, Mindful Fire is about creating more awareness and choice in your life. Mindfulness helps you develop self-awareness to know yourself better and what's most important to you by practicing a kind, curious awareness. Envisioning is all about choosing to think big about your life and putting the power of your predicting brain to work to create the life you dream of. And financial independence brings awareness and choice to your financial life, empowering you to make your vision a reality by getting your money sorted out and ultimately making work optional. And here's the best part. You don't have to wait until you reach financial independence to live out your vision. Mindful Fire is about using these tools to craft that life now on the path to financial independence and beyond. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Let's jump into today's episode. Mike, welcome to the Mindful Fire podcast. I'm so glad to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one for a while and excited to talk about coaching yourself up. And before we get into what that means and how we can all start to coach ourselves more to live the life that we want, I'd love to hear a little bit about you, your journey, and what you're up to in the world.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I appreciate that. And as a 60-year-old, I have a long journey, but I'll try to keep it short. So I have an engineering background, and that led me into a 25-year corporate career. I'm born and raised out here in the Bay Area in California, and so spent the first 10 years of my career doing technical work and leveraging my engineering degree, and then fortunately had an opportunity to try my hand at a human resources role and ended up loving that. And so when I talk about my 25-year career, I talk about roughly 10 years doing technical work and then the latter 15 years being in human resources and really almost exclusively learning and development. So a lot of experience with management development, leadership development, employee onboarding, et cetera. And a little over 10 years ago, Adam, had a number of curveballs thrown at me by the universe. I went through a divorce, no kids, so I would call that amicable but stressful. My then ex-wife ended up with a serious year-long health scare that took a lot of effort and emotional energy on my part to support her. And then a couple years after that, I lost my mom. And she was just 69, and I was very close to her. And that led me to take a break from corporate. And that break went from a few months to a year. And that's when I had my own transformation around what I wanted to do with my life. And so the last 10 years, Adam, I've been out on my own as a leadership trainer, leadership coach. And as you alluded to, you've mentioned the phrase, coach yourself up. I've created a training program and written a book about an idea I have called self-coaching. And so that's what I'm up to in the world. Is my current purpose is to help as many people as possible achieve more of their potential through heightened self-awareness. And I know from listening to prior episodes of your podcast that you are also a huge fan of self-awareness and becoming more aware of how we're showing up, to use a phrase that I think you and I both like to use.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's a lot that I would love to dig in on there. I definitely want to talk about self-awareness, but you mentioned that you took a career break. Your mom passed away. Obviously, that's a extremely challenging time. How did you think about taking that career break? And I guess what was your plan there? And like, how did that change things for you when you actually created that space to take some time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what's interesting, my plan was to take 3 or 4 months to process what I had just been through over the past several years.
Mhm.
And then the phrase I like to use is then go do it again, right? Like I was going to go find myself. So my last 2 jobs, I ran the learning and development function at companies, and I thought that I'd want to do that again. I wanted more money, right? I didn't feel secure enough. And it was interesting because to your point, as I gave myself the space and took the time to just decompress from 25 years of working really hard and very long hours and really, I think, being subsumed by it much more so than I experienced in the moment. What I found is that as I reflected on 25 years of, let's just call it workaholic and just becoming immersed in the machine of corporate America, which I didn't really see as being immersed in the machine of corporate America while I was in it. And so having that time to step back and really think about what was important to me, I ended up, like I went to Esalen for a workshop around finding your purpose. This is when I signed up for and started going through the Hudson coaching program down in Santa Barbara. And it was early on in my Hudson journey that I gave myself permission to take a full year off. So that was a huge shift for the guy who was like 3 or 4 months and then I got to get back at it and be making money again and cranking away to like, you know what, like I'll be okay if I go for a year without revenue. And I realized I was very fortunate to be in a position where I could say that. But what was interesting, Adam, is the Mike Normant that left corporate America a few months before that couldn't have fathomed the idea of not having that income. And so there was a shift in how I related to money that gave me more degrees of freedom to give myself more time to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And it was also during that period that I had a couple of transformations. One was around my relationship to money. One was around my relationship to risk taking. One was around my relationship to people, me needing people to like me, where this idea that, oh, I think I've just coached myself through these big shifts. And what if I were able to package that in a way and share it with other people? And so that became the catalyst. My own transformative experience became the catalyst of wanting to make that available to other people in a digestible way.
Very interesting. I always like to dig into these big shifts for people and these breaks that people take in their careers, because that's usually where some sort of evolution happens. And I think I would say most people probably want to take breaks, but very few people actually do take breaks in this country, at least. And so I actually had a conversation with a woman named Katrina McGee, who that is what she does. She helps people take career breaks. And so we had a great conversation about her framework for before, during, and after a career break. And it's top of mind for me. And I've noticed in my own experience taking breaks, most recently taking 3 months off for mental health leave, just the need to decompress and have that kind of detached perspective of what it's like working, right? Like in corporate America, in these fast-paced companies where the expectations just keep going up and up. And yeah, now going back into it, after that break, it's like, wow, holy cow, like this is so aggressive. It's so aggressive. And I'm in a unique situation now where it's extra challenging, which I don't need to go into, but all the kind of more intuitive and ease-based action that I was taking goes out the door when there's this feeling of having to perform and having people measuring your performance and all these things. It's just a lot. And so I think that I would definitely encourage people to think about how can you create some space in your life to take a break, right? To use financial independence to do that. And it sounds like you had that benefit, right? You had worked for many years. You had created a financial cushion that you could rely on to do that. And I was in the same situation when I've taken my career breaks, and I've only done 3 months, and would very much like to take longer because it takes a couple months, 2-3 months just to even start to settle.
Yeah, it really does. And it's interesting because that phrase financial independence, I don't know if heavy is the right word. It's a big phrase, and I could see where it means different things to different people. And just as I heard you reflect back to me, your sense of me being able to take that break and creating that cushion. And it's so interesting, Adam, because when I left the workplace and my mindset was 3 to 4 month break, and then I'm coming back. And that had everything to do with I need more money. And that idea of financial independence tying for me at that moment in my life to some mythical number or some amount of money that I would need to have in the bank to be able to say, I don't need to work anymore. And through that period of time, starting to really reflect on my relationship with money. And I've heard you talk on this program multiple times with different people about what is enough. And that comes in flavor of money. It comes in the flavor of satisfaction. It kind of like all the different dimensions that we measure what is enough. And it was really cool because I started to realize that I didn't need to have as much as I originally thought I needed to have, or maybe said a different way, that I can trust myself that I will not go down some rabbit hole or spiral down a drain of going broke. So the financial independence shifted for me from needing some X amount of money in the bank to feel like I can retire versus it's more about my relationship with finance, and there's an independence of worry or stress around how much money was in the bank. And so what's interesting is I've gone into significant debt to start this business that I've started. And I've recently drawn the line and said, no more, I can't go further into debt. But again, I'll talk about the old Mike. Like, there's no way the old Mike would be sitting in front of you here today talking about putting so much effort into building this business and being even willing to go into debt, because I now trust myself that I'll figure out a way to get out of debt. It's going to be okay. My quality of life is fine. I've given up a lot of the fancier things that I might want to have, but they're not necessary. And I love my life. I almost got a little stressed out when you talked about going back to work and the performance culture and the aggressiveness. And it's like, you know what? I didn't ever have that. I never went back. And so I can imagine if I went back, it'd be like, holy cow, I did this for 25 years. Wow.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm getting to. And I'm thinking it's interesting because we were talking before I started recording that my vision, I'm realizing my vision in multiple ways right now, and it's going to continue to evolve. But one of the visions that I had for my work at Google, and the reason I've stayed as long as I have, is because I had this what I call my on-the-job side hustle, where I was able to facilitate workshops, create workshops. And my vision is to basically move into a role where I lead envisioning workshops for Google's most important client relationships. And I think that would be super interesting. But now as I get close to it, I'm like, is that what I want still? Because I'm like, maybe I want to do that as a consultant rather than an employee, because I really just being in this culture of like needing to have all these like performance reviews and these everyone needs to know what you're doing. Like, no, I'm over that. I'm done. I'm done with that. I don't want that. Maybe it's still valuable as a means to an end, right? Like to plant the seeds, so to speak, and to lay the foundation, to mix metaphors, of this business that I want to create later on. It might be a stepping stone, but it just feels so exhausting to have to deal with all of that all the time. And I'd rather just have one client or have a client and deliver for that client. And if they're happy, they hire me again. If they're not happy, they don't hire me again, rather than having to like do the monkey dance for some system that is designed to extract the maximum value from every person in it. It just feels exhausting.
Yeah.
So it's cool to hear how you had that realization that you have enough, and more importantly, that you can trust yourself to make the money that you need to support your life and to be resourceful no matter what life throws your way. I think that is a really important realization and brings us back to self-awareness. As you said, I am a huge proponent of self-awareness. I think it's really the foundation for all growth. And so I would be interested to have you explain how you think about self-awareness and how it relates to coaching yourself.
So for me, and in fact, maybe I'll share a story. So during that gap year that we've been talking about that I took, that turned into a gap year. I did not take a gap year. I took a few months, and then that turned into, hey, I could take more time. One of the things that I found, and I know from hearing various conversations from you, that you've always had this entrepreneurial itch, right? And so I would say the exact opposite. I loved having a corporate job. I loved the security of the paycheck. I loved having a boss to tell me what to do. Like, and again, I don't know that I'm that rare, but that was how I was wired. And so I met bunches of people along the way. It was like, oh, I can't wait to work for myself someday. And I was always like, no, not me. I'm good. Like that paycheck coming in is just fantastic. And so as I was in my time off between jobs, started to contemplate this notion of going out on my own, and just had almost 50 years of lived experience that was telling me, no, way too risky. You got to find your own work. It's like, it's too hard. And with that, I mentioned I went to this workshop, Esalen, with a woman talking about finding your purpose. And I had a really long conversation with her about that. Yeah, I wanted to raise self-awareness in the world, and yet not a risk taker. Right. I'm very comfortable with, and this woman looked at me and she said, that's a story. So there I am, 47 years old, having run the learning and development function multiple times. I facilitate Myers-Briggs workshops. Like, I'm a pretty self-aware dude. And this woman tells me that's a story. And I looked at her and like, you're freaking nuts, right? Like, I don't know what you're talking about. I know me. This is how I'm wired. I don't take risks. She left me some questions to ponder. And over the course of, I'd say, a number of weeks, I started to think, like, what if that's just a story? What if I made that up? And that started opening the door. And so the jump to the end version is, over a couple of months, I essentially decided that when something risky came up, I would no longer just default to, no, Mike doesn't do risk, to pause. Let me look at this risk. Does it serve my purpose? If so, go for it. So again, I'm not jumping out of airplanes or rappelling down the side of large mountains, but I took the risk to start a business because it served my purpose. And so essentially that's a way for me to get into when I think about self-awareness, because self-awareness is this massive, like, there's so many dimensions. And what I focus on in my work are three aspects of self-awareness that I think are really helpful to people. One is around their attention, which dovetails right into mindfulness. And then one is around self-limiting behaviors. How do our actions get in our way? And then I think the biggest one is this idea of stories, self-limiting stories, the beliefs that we've created about ourselves through our life and our lived experience that get in our way. And some of us see it and a lot of us don't. And like I said, the example I just gave, I lived as if I was not a risk taker. That was a fact to me, and yet it wasn't. And so I've put together tools to help people strengthen their attention, which is helping them to be more present more often, which then gives them the ability to become strong self-observers. You know, Adam, I've heard you mention a lot about noticing, right? So I talk about self-observation. Start paying attention to your patterns, start paying attention to your self-talk, bring it more into your awareness. And then that opens the door as I get more clarity on what stories sit underneath my behaviors. So I'm not speaking up in meetings. Okay, what am I telling myself? Oh, people are going to think I'm dumb, whatever it is. Once you have clarity on the story, you can then start to challenge the story. You referenced in a podcast not too long ago the work of Byron Katie. She has her 4 questions and I have 5 questions, and they start at the same place around how do I know this is true? And then it diverges. Mine goes a different direction than hers, but it's that same notion that, hey, how true is this? And if it weren't true, how might I act differently? And then how can I experiment with acting differently? I think I answered your question.
Yeah, no, it definitely did answer my question, which was how do you think about self-awareness? And so I love the story about your story that you weren't even aware of. And I think that is so true of most people, right? And, you know, I mean, I would say if it's true for someone who's done all that work, helped other people do the work of developing self-awareness, getting to know themselves, me having meditated and invested in mindfulness and learning and all these things. And still, there are these stories that are below the surface that are, for better or worse, running many aspects of our life. And we are not even aware of them. And they seem so normal. You know, I've had my own around like, I can't stick to things, right? That was a story I used to tell myself. And then I decided I was going to try meditating and I enjoyed it. So I continued to do it. And that story now has less power than it did, right? It shows me that actually I can stick to things, right? And, you know, I have my own slew of them that I'm working through right now. But I think that a lot of people have most people have these stories and they are just not conscious of them. So bringing them into awareness, conscious awareness is the first step to actually working on them. And you mentioned you have some practices around helping people improve their attention and observe their behaviors, and then ultimately, you know, rewire these stories. I'd love to hear, you know, maybe you can take them one at a time and share a little bit about each of these practices that people can put into practice in their life to start to do this work.
Sure. Before I go there, and so if you could put a pin in that question, I think I'm going to remember it. But you said this notion that for many of us, most of our stories are blind spots, these self-limiting beliefs, right? And are you familiar with the field of vertical development? Have you heard that phrase?
I have not.
Yeah. So vertical development, Keegan and Leahy at Harvard, who are some of the early thinkers on this idea. The intended succinct version of this, Adam, is that if you think about horizontal development as more information, more knowledge, skill building, that's referred to as horizontal development, in contrast to what they call vertical development, which is more internal mindset, ability to deal with complexity, et cetera. And one of the cool things, and this is it's a little technical, but I'll just say it this way, is they talk about subject-object theory. And so just using as an example, my story that I'm not a risk taker, I was subject to that story. I lived that story. And the idea of shifting, vertically growing to the point where I can see that story that I think is me. It's an object that I can hold in my hand and look at and say, oh, that's interesting. Where'd that come from? How did that manifest in your life? And all of a sudden it changes. And so for me, Adam, that shift was transformational in just how I experienced my life and the world. All of a sudden, you start to see that everything's story. And I can't tell you, Adam, how many times a day I'll say to my partner, Ellen, so this is what happened, and here's the story I made up about that. I'm a walking, I know I'm making up stories, and I make that visible to other people. And of course, I still get trapped in my stories at times. So anyway, just wanted to say that. Now, going back to your question about these 3 different areas and ideas on them, strengthening intention. So I have a 3-step model called the self-coaching path. I'm an engineer. Got to have a process. Got to have a path. 3 steps. Check, check, check. And the first step is strengthening attention. And I learned some really cool ideas about attention from a self-awareness teacher that has given me carte blanche to propagate his teachings into the world. And in the interest of time, I won't do the experiential piece, but let's just say there's a very cool idea of, through some exercises, you can start to see that our attention is dynamic and it's always moving around. So even the listeners right now who are listening to us with an intention to focus all of their attention on us, maybe they might be purposefully multitasking. But even if they're not, even if they're intending to listen to this, thoughts pop up. Oh, what are we having for dinner? Like, oh, I have to get back to Jim about that deliverable. So our attention is bouncing around both externally and internally. And there's this idea of the geography of attention that says our attention moves in and through 3 places. It can be in our body, it can be in the world, or more accurately, your world as experienced through your 5 senses, or in your mind, and you're in thought. Just having that geography can be so helpful. It's sort of like seeing your stories. It's almost like seeing your attention in a brand new way. All of a sudden, I'm more aware when my attention is somewhere other than where I want it to be. And especially in our heads, because that's where we can easily be sitting in a meeting thinking 1,000 different thoughts about other things and not necessarily even recognizing that we're thinking 1,000 thoughts about different things. And so starting to be aware, like, oh, I'm in my head thinking about other stuff. Let me come back to the meeting. It's very similar to a meditation practice of coming back to the breath, right? Which is a bodily sensation. That's a body focus.
So there's these 3 places, geographical places, the body, the mind, and our world, our external world, that the mind could go to when it's not where we intend it to be. And so when we notice that our mind has wandered, it's in one of those 3 places, and that gives us the ability to say, oh, it's in my body. Let me bring it back.
And I tend to use the word attention versus mind, because I think for a lot of people, mind is the thought piece. But yes, and I've heard you say, and I've said many times, attention defines your reality, right? Mm-hmm. Our attention is what drives our experience. And of course, our stories drive our reality as well. But so the idea, Adam, with that, so as I learned to more effectively, and oh, by the way, another big aspect of that I preach, maybe is a little strong, but is the power of being present. And so what's cool about that geography is the only time you can be in your body or your world is in the present moment, right? You can't be in your world at any other time than now. It's like, oh, but I just watched this TV show. Yeah, now you're in your mind thinking about the TV show that you watched. It's not what you're seeing now, right, with your eyes. So now people will hear like, oh, how do I get more present? I can use this geography as a way like, oh, bring my attention to my body, bring my attention to my world, get present.
So if you're in conversation with somebody like we are, this is my world, right? I'm choosing to place my attention on you in this conversation. So that in terms of your 3 geographical places would be my world.
More specifically, it's your seeing and your hearing that are intending to focus on me. That's your world, right?
And I guess I could also be talking with you, and then something else in my world could distract me, right?
Absolutely.
So I could get a ping on this other screen that distracts me from our conversation. Now my attention is split or directed over there, and I can become aware of that and bring it back.
Or you could get sucked in and start thinking about like, oh, I better respond or da, da, da. And so, having more awareness of this distraction that's pulling you and just to say, oh, wait, I'm about to be distracted. Come back.
So how does somebody cultivate this awareness of where their attention is and strengthening their attention through having this map, so to speak? Like, what's the practice, right? I mean, this is what you're describing is mindfulness is very much related to this, right?
Yeah.
Like a kind, curious awareness of what's going on in your internal world, your body, your mind, and your external environment is how I define it. And so I know how to cultivate mindfulness through practices like focused attention. Is it the same, or are there other practices that you find useful in kind of strengthening the attention?
I think it's mostly the same, Adam. One of the practices I have in my program is I call it 5 minutes per day. And it's 5 minutes per day. Try to bring your attention to the present moment. And I encourage people who have a meditation practice to add these 5 minutes per day on top of that. You will be surprised if you haven't done this kind of work to learn how hard it is to do 5 minutes. And so I said, even if you get like 20 or 30 seconds at a clip of being really in the moment and then getting distracted and be like, okay, it's cool, but try to get that 5 cumulative minutes a day, like a meditation practice. For many people, it just starts to become a little more of a habit, as we've talked about earlier, right? Like, okay, do I spend 24 hours a day entirely focused on where my attention is? Absolutely not. We don't manage our attention so that we're going to be perfect at managing our attention. We practice managing our attention so we get better at it. And it's like all these things, it's a lifetime practice. So that's one practice. Another one I have is pick 1 or 2 or 3 conversations or meetings and really set an intention as you go into that to really be present with the other person and be kind to yourself when at the 3 or 4 or 7 minute mark, when it's like, I can't, so just let it go. But it's this intention of starting to try to use it more often and in more places. And then over time, your new neural pathways start to kick in and I can do this for 30 seconds now instead of 20. And just slowly strengthen those muscles, right? It's going to the gym. You're strengthening your brain muscles on this.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's so important to realize that this is not the default way that our minds work. Our minds are meant creating thoughts all the time, right? So our attention is bouncing around from thing to thing. And this is a practice of cultivating presence and focused attention. And just like anything else, at first it's going to be extremely hard. I think what helps me the most is knowing that it's going to be hard and that the mind is going to wander. Your attention is going to wander, and to expect that. And then to be kind when it happens. And as you do it more and more, it's going to become easier and easier, just like every other skill that you've built in your life. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. And so right now that I have some new information around managing my attention and I'm starting to think about mind, body, world and how that works. So now I'm going to step into step 2 of the self-coaching path, which is observing oneself. I used the example earlier. I'll just keep pulling the thread, right? On somebody doesn't speak up in meetings and they're getting feedback like, hey, we're concerned you're not contributing and people are wondering whether you're engaged. Or I joke that I call it the New Year's resolution approach to change, which would be dude, just start speaking up in meetings. Just do it. Like, what could be so hard? It's like, no, it might even work for a week or 2. But one of my mantras is you have to do the inner work to make a lasting outer change. And so instead of diving in and starting to speak up more, it's now let's put some energy on paying attention to yourself in those moments when you're sitting in a meeting and you're not saying anything. And I don't know if you've ever had that for you, Adam, but for a lot of people, it's very clear when they have something they'd like to say, but they hold back. It's like, I'm going to hold back. I'm not going to say anything, whatever. And so it's in those moments, what's going on for you. And now this is tricky because you still want to be in the meeting, right? So you are splitting your attention a little bit. Most of the time, that self-talk, it just is, right? We're subject to it. And starting to look at it as an object, like, what am I telling myself? Oh, people are going to think I'm dumb. Oh, if people don't like what I say, then maybe they won't like me anymore. If like whatever it is, because again, I could have 10 people who aren't speaking up in meetings, and there's 10 different things going on for those 10 different people. That's where they need to do their work on the personal thing that's getting in their way. And so it's paying attention to what the stories are you're telling yourself, the self-talk. It's paying attention to feelings, and it's also looking for triggers. And so as I start to spend a little time with that, and some people, Adam, you'll say, so do you know what the story is? And they'll say, yeah, I know exactly what the story is, right? Some people know this. Other people it's a brand new, like, I don't know, like, this is really interesting. Let me pay attention and learn. And so then the third step, what I call being responsible, response-able, the ability to choose a response instead of reacting. We know that coaches ask their clients challenging questions. As I alluded to earlier, I have a set of questions that people can use to challenge their own thinking, to challenge their own stories that they have about themselves. And without going through the whole list, one of those questions in there, first of all, as we said, it starts around how true is this? I talk about the difference between capital T objective truth and small t subjective truth. Because to us, they're true, but is it true? Capital T, true. And as we get more comfortable starting to realize that maybe these things aren't as true as we think they are, there's a question there like, if you didn't believe this were true, how might you act differently? And in the case we're talking about, sometimes I'd speak up more. Okay. And then the final question of the 5 is, how will you experiment with acting differently? There's a couple of key things I'd highlight there. One is it's action oriented. It's not will you act, it's how will you experiment with acting differently? And then a key word in there is experiment. And I'm guessing you use this word or concept in your work, right? But if I'm holding something as an experiment, a scientist does an experiment, there's never a failure. It reveals new information. So if I'm going to start trying to speak up in meetings, if I'm holding it as anything other than an experiment, it could be very easy if something goes sideways for me to consider it a failure or, whatever it is. Whereas if it's an experiment, what can I learn from this? And then the last thing I would share, Adam, is I have this idea. I call it, I'm laughing because I'd love to find a pithier way to say it, but it's the experimentation staircase. So take the person who's not speaking up in meetings. Not all meetings are created equal. So the staircase says, think about the meetings that you are participating in. Which of them feel lowest risk, right? Medium risk, high risk. Like if you're going to start speaking up in meetings, don't choose the meeting that you have next week with the CEO and all the bosses in the room. Start with your intact team right? And start to essentially, you start to disprove your stories. Like, oh, I spoke up and the world didn't end like I thought it might. It's very methodical. I think there's a lot of overlap with cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which I didn't realize as I was putting it together, but that's how it ended up just based on my own experience. And yeah, I think it's an amazing skill for people to have, to be able to work with themselves, work on themselves, to shift behaviors. And oh, by the way, shift mindsets and stories can be completely transformative.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And I've done a lot of this work myself in my own life without really having such a helpful framework because I was just figuring out I was going. And, something you said way back in the beginning of our conversation is that like you were not even aware that you had this story, or you were aware that you didn't take risks in that example, but you
That was who I
thought
was.
it was who you were, right? You didn't
Yeah.
realize it was a story, right?
Right.
And when I started meditating and training my attention and cultivating my awareness and all of that, I started to see the inner critic, right? I kind of sort of knew it was there, but like these stories kept coming up. Oh, you're doing it wrong. You're not good enough. It's not going to work out. You don't stick to things, blah, blah, blah. All these stories that were there under the surface, kind of running my life, right? Painting my experience, or being the lenses through which I saw my world and acted and took action in my world and in my life. And I was totally unaware of it for so long. As I started to cultivate attention and awareness, I started to notice these patterns. And then I now could see how those were influencing my behaviors a little bit more. And I could start to ask a question that I find very helpful. Is this useful? If this story that I'm telling myself isn't useful, I can just let it go. Before, when I was unaware of it, I didn't have that agency because I didn't have that awareness. And so now that I'm aware of these stories, I can ask, is this useful, or what might be more useful? And then I can choose a different action, right? It may come up again 5 minutes from now, but I can always have that awareness and that kind, curious awareness of mindfulness to say, oh, there it is again. Okay, I'm going to let it go again, and I'm going to keep moving forward. So I'd love to switch gears a little bit, Mike, and I'd love to tie this coaching yourself up framework to a bigger vision, right? I talk a lot about envisioning here. I'm a huge proponent of thinking really big about what's possible for your life and using envisioning to dream up a big vision for your life and put your predicting brain to work to make it happen. And so I'm curious what you see as the overlap, the connection point between I have this big vision I'm trying to pursue, and I need to recognize these stories that are holding me back or not the most helpful or useful. How do you think about the connection between this coach yourself up framework and pursuing a big, audacious vision for your life?
Yeah, that's great. And, as I was getting ready for this conversation, Adam, I was thinking about that. And what dawned on me is that when I think about your work, and you just mentioned, you're helping people create these audacious vision for what they're hoping to implement in their life and the kind of life they want to live and what that looks like and what it feels like, et cetera. And I realized it's like, you know what, like we're doing a lot of similar things. It's just, the way I would say is you're working more at a macro scale, and my self-coaching approach, I think, is more in the micro, and I don't want to be dismissive of it by labeling it that way. But if I am working with Adam and he has me thinking these big visions about what I want to do, I'm confident that there are going to be lots of little things in your behavior you will get in your own way. And those self-limiting behaviors and self-limiting stories can be limiting, if not completely crushing. And so the self-coaching gives one approach for working through each of those obstacles that is between you and that big vision. So I think that's where I would make the connection, if that makes sense.
Got it. Yeah. So, there are things that are going to come up on your path as you're pursuing it that you're going to start to notice, like, oh, I keep having this story about I can't do hard things.
Can't take risk.
Can't take risk, right? Like I want to be an entrepreneur, but I can't take risks. So those things, as they come up again and again as patterns, then you can start to explore them using this framework.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. In fact, the more I've thought about it, the more it feels almost hand in glove a little bit. It's like, yeah, you're trying to make these big overarching changes in your life. And in order to do that, you're going to need to make multiple changes in your life around behavior and mindset, et cetera, that will open the door for you to have this bigger achievement.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. I like how succinct it is. I like how practical it is. And yeah, I think that it's super useful for anyone looking to work on themselves, especially in particular unhelpful beliefs that they might be holding, that they realize they're not helpful. They can start to use this to address them and work on them.
Yeah. And it's interesting, Adam, because it's been really tricky to figure out how to tell people who many of them are unaware of the impact of these self-limiting beliefs or even the existence of self-limiting beliefs, and try to say, hey, getting over your self-limiting beliefs is going to be really powerful. And I think a lot of people go, well, I don't have any. I'm just not a risk taker. And so I've been playing with this idea. They say that when Henry Ford was, and I know that name carries a lot of baggage now, but when the automobile was first coming online, there was nobody in the market that said, I'd love to have a car, right? They were, I'd love to have a faster horse. And I feel like what you and I are offering is a car where most people are thinking they need a faster horse. So I've just been playing with how to help more people actually internalize or understand how powerful this idea of shifting from I am my stories to I can examine my stories and challenge them and shift how I experience my world. It's such a big deal. And again, hard to just, the idea of a more self-aware world where people were all walking around understanding that they're making up stories all the time and articulating that, like, it would be an amazing thing.
I think that it's certainly happening. There's more and more people aware of there's more people meditating because there's things like Headspace and Calm and these apps that are reaching millions of people. And so I think that is the gateway where it's like, oh, I describe that our minds are like a snow globe that we're constantly shaking up and agitating. And mindfulness is like setting the snow globe down on the table, allowing the snow to settle and seeing more clearly what's inside. As more and more people do that and try that, and there is going to be more appetite for this type of thing. And I think also that there's just more people looking to perform better, right? Like whether it be productivity stuff or whatever, like it's all related, self-development, things like that. I think that's continuing to grow. And so there's going to be more and more need for this type of thing.
And I want to say one thing. You mentioned the word gateway, and that's how I see myself. I see myself as a gateway to self-awareness. And I've had, you know how our culture works, right? It's like, okay, you've got package A. Now, how are you going to get them to package B and package C? And I've just said, nope, I'm package A guy. That's my calling, is to open the door for people. And then when they say, what's next, is like, there's Adam, there's 1,000 nexts, right? Like there's a whole bunch of people who are doing really deep, awesome work in various spaces of personal growth and finding your path and all that good stuff. But so I love the idea of gateway, and that's where I stand firmly planted.
That in itself is self-awareness, right? Like that for you, right?
Yes.
So cool. Let's shift gears now into the Mindful Fire Final Four. Are you ready?
I am. Bring it.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about it just now, but I'd love for you to share your big vision for bringing more self-awareness into the world. And I know before we started recording, you were talking about some of the ways you're thinking about doing that. I'd love for you to put that out there here and share kind of your big vision for that goal and, how people can engage with you on that.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. As mentioned, my purpose is to help as many people as possible achieve more of their potential through heightened self-awareness. And I think a more self-aware world is one that I want to live in. And another somewhat implicit in that statement, but not really, is that I'm passionate about bringing the benefits of coaching to more people, right? To make the benefits of coaching more accessible. And so one place that happens is I have a training program, right? It's a 6-week program. There's an online version. There's a cohort version. But going after the B2B space, right? Like how many thousands of people work inside corporations from training, although Search Inside Yourself is a great example that is going after the employee as opposed to just managers and above. And so I'm really big on, hey, let's build a coaching culture. Let's build a more conscious culture. Let's help more of our employees have access to these tools. So that's one avenue. And another avenue that I'm really excited about that I'm putting more energy into lately is to work with other coaches to help them be aware of this, and really, mostly in the camp of coaches bump into people that could benefit from coaching, but for whatever reason, whether financial limitations or just mindset, it's like, not yet. But just to have something at a lower price point that they can offer to clients that, again, I don't see self-coaching replacing the value of coaching and working with a coach. I do see it augmenting it significantly, whether it's before you work with a coach, this will make you a much better coachee. And for some people, you'll never have the luxury of working with a coach. And this is so much better than nothing. And yeah, my website is the place to go. So coachyourselfup.com is where people would find out more about that. There's a resources page with some handouts. I've got a thing that lists all these common self-limiting behaviors so people can see, like, what are they talking about? And do any of those look like me? You can download the first chapter of my book. If anybody who's listening is interested in learning more or just jumping into my program, please send me an email through my website and mention this podcast, and I'll give a coupon for a significant discount.
Great. That's wonderful to hear. And yeah, I think that there's a lot to both of those avenues, both the making it available for employees, right? I've been a longtime facilitator of Search Inside Yourself. I've lived and seen the benefits of that work, and the foundation of that is also self-awareness. So I think that there's a lot of benefit in that area. And then, of course, as you mentioned, coaching is very much building on self-awareness. And so I think it's a perfect precursor or complement. And as you said, not everyone's going to be able to afford working with a coach or have the situation where that would make sense in some scenarios. So this is a tool that they can use to help themselves over and through some difficult things that will help them unlock their potential. So I love that.
Yeah.
So the second question, Mike, is what piece of advice would you give to someone early on their path to financial independence?
My answer is not going to surprise you or any of your listeners, which is invest in personal growth. Invest in developing your self-awareness. One of your recent guests said it beautifully, like you are your biggest asset. And again, my lived experience, Adam, I think your lived experience is that becoming more self-aware around our patterns and how we're showing up and learning how to show up differently. And in fact, it is a form of envisioning. You've got the envision, the big thing. I've got the let me envision starting to take some risks, right? And so again, self-awareness, invest in yourself, personal growth, begin or continue your lifelong journey in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's huge. That is something that for the longest time I didn't even consider because I didn't want to spend money on anything. And it's not even just money, right? It's time, energy, knowledge, relationships, right? All of these domains help us grow in terms of our self-awareness. And so just having that as an intention. And I was just thinking last night or the night before that, like, I think that is, for me, some things that have been challenging are like investing in my healthy habits, right? Exercising regularly, eating healthy consistently, going to sleep at a good time, right? Because I have young kids. So like my time for myself is after they go to bed. Seeing the investment of going to sleep and waking up fresh the next day to then make better choices the next day. Like, I think that I'm really looking to something that I'm talking about is mindset affirmation. So just something that's like a mantra or a belief that I want to embody. Keeping that top of mind is just seeing myself and my body as an investment, just like I would invest money in the stock market. So that's something that's been top of mind for me as well. So
Yeah.
totally agree. And the third question is, what piece of advice would you give to someone getting started with meditation and or mindfulness?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit already in our conversation. I think it's starting small, right? If somebody, I remember when I started the idea of like, oh, I should do this 10 minutes a day. And that was too hard. So instead of backing up, I just stopped, right? And so for me, it was start with a reasonable goal. So for me, it was, I'm going to meditate a couple days a week for 5 minutes. And I'm going to be kind to myself if I don't adhere to that. And you mentioned earlier these apps. I actually used Headspace and found it really helpful to me. So I tried a couple, and the Headspace, something about that guy's British voice that just really
People
landed
love
for
it.
me. And so I started, probably a couple days a week, and then maybe added a day, and then at some point got to the point where I was doing it most days, and it's crazy. And now as the engineer, what I found helpful for me, Adam, is if it's something I want to do, and you could apply this to healthy eating, drinking, exercising. Like I have a spreadsheet that I go in and I track. And so I started almost competing with myself I've had stretches now where I've meditated like 2 years in a row without miss. And it's like, that's cool. And then it's like, I'll miss a day. And I go, but consider if the way you are wired is that some sort of tracking might help you with, you mentioned earlier, sticking to things. Might a tracker help you?
Very good. Yeah. Great advice. Start small, figure out what kind of accountability is helpful for you. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, you said start small, and I realized one of my mantras that I did not say here today was small shifts lead to big changes. And that's right. That's the staircase we talked about earlier. This is not about starting to speak up immediately. It's like find little places to start, and over time, it just the new habit, the new pattern will grow. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I love that. I'm glad you shared that. And yeah, I think you called it the experimentation staircase. I think is great. I have a concept of mini experiments that I talk about and going to be doing this week with my cohort, my group coaching program. And it's just like, what is something easy that you could do to just test the waters, to just try it, just to move one step forward? And because, like you said, small shifts
lead to big changes.
Yeah, small shifts lead to big changes. And that is absolutely true and works every time if you keep making those small shifts. I think it's a great reminder. All right, Mike, the last question is, how can people connect with you online? You mentioned your website again, but I want to give you a chance to just say, hey, here's where you can find me online, learn more about what you're up to, your programs, and just connect with you.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So yeah, I won't beat that horse again, but coachyourselfup.com is my website where you can find about my programs and offerings and sign up for a newsletter. And then I do have a name that is unique enough that I'm really easy to find on LinkedIn. So Mike Normant, ends in T, Normant. And feel free to follow or reach out to connect there. And yeah, I just thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation today, Adam. I'm grateful to have the bullhorn, and I appreciate what you're doing in the world, and I know you appreciate what I'm up to. And as you said, there's a lot more of this happening, and more people are waking up to this self-awareness and how much we tend to get in our own way, and that we can do something about it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mike, for being here and having this conversation with me. I really enjoyed it, and I know that people have gotten a lot out of it. So I do invite you all to go check out coachyourselfup.com, connect with Mike on LinkedIn, and send him any questions that you have as you get into his work. Thank you again for being here, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me on today's episode of the Mindful Fire podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, I invite you to hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this. This just lets the platforms know you're getting value from the episodes and you want to be here when I release additional content. If you're ready to start your Mindful Fire journey, go to mindfulfire.org/start and download my free envisioning guide. In just 10 minutes, this guide will help you craft a clear and inspiring vision for your life. Again, you can download it for free at mindfulfire.org/start. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next time on the Mindful Fire Podcast.